Hi, and welcome to Brentwood Stories. On February 27, 2020, the Brentwood Public Library hosted Dr. Zebulon Miletsky for a conference on African Americans and the right to vote. Zebulon was joined by panelists Mia Brett, Willie Mack, and Willie Johnson Jr. as they discussed an array of voters' rights topics. Zebulon is an assistant professor of Africana Studies and History at Stony Brook University. He is the author of numerous articles and essays, has hosted his own TED Talk, and is the author of an upcoming book on the civil rights movement in Boston. Zebulon has come to the library on more than one occasion now, and you can learn more about him and his most recent visit in a feature recently published by Newsday newspaper. I will let Zebulon and his esteemed panelists take it from here. Enjoy.
We are very excited to talk about our work and to share with you and to have really engage, of course, as always happens here at Brentwood Public Library, in a discussion with folks who have come. So my name is Zebulon Miletsky. I'm an assistant professor of Africana Studies and History at Stony Brook University. I see some familiar faces, a couple in the audience, and it's good to see folks out again. If they come back, that means you didn't stink it up too bad the first time, and so that's good. I just want to welcome everybody. And I'm going to move fairly quickly because we only have an hour, and we really hope to pack quite a bit in. Let's see. So on our panel here, to my left, starting all the way to the far left, we have Willie Mack. And Willie Mack is a second-year PhD history student at Stony Brook University. His research interests include 20th century U.S. history, carceral studies, capitalism, and inequality. He just had an article published on the Society for United States History blog, and has an article pending publication for the African American Intellectual History Society blog, both focusing on the role of race in policing and within mass media. And so he's going to be talking with us tonight a little bit, his part talking about felony disenfranchisement in particular. His essay on the building of Long Island, which examines the history of racial capitalism and segregation on Long Island, has been recently featured in the Race and Capitalism Project's Digital Forum Next Chapter. And moving right along, we also have with us Mia Brett, who brings a wealth of experience to her role as a PhD candidate currently in American legal history at Stony Brook. She is the co-founder of All Women's Progress, a political advocacy group transitioning to an intersectional feminist think tank. She has spearheaded 2 voting rights initiatives, Voter Empowerment Day, hashtag Voter Empowerment Day, kind of important part of this. She's big on Twitter, y'all, check her out. Dedicated to empowering people to combat voter suppression and step up and vote, targeted to voting at HBCUs in particular. She has also written on voter suppression and women. So she's kind of a big deal. And last but not least, to my immediate left here, is William Johnson Jr., who has a bachelor's in history with a specialization in Islam and Africa, and now he is a master's candidate in Africana Studies. He's been working with, he's taken my class, he's worked with a number of my colleagues in the department, and recently sounds like he's shifting in direction and focusing a little bit more on the continent. And his work in progress project is the Somalian state, conflict of identity, political Islamization, and the peace-building initiatives of the African Union mission in Somalia. He's also been inducted into the Phi Alpha Theta for his scholarship in the field of history, and also Delta Alpha Pi for academic excellence. He is a proud member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, as myself. And he's also, like our other 2 panelists, he brings some interesting, shall we call it, extracurricular activities. He's a professional jazz drummer with the National has worked with the National Endowment of the Arts as with master drummer, Jimmy Cobb, most noted for his recording with Miles Davis, "Kind of Blue." And he's been featured in New York Times, Village Voice, Harlem Times, and Billboard magazine for his musical work. And he's also quite a sharp thinker. I can attest to this as my former, having been in my class, in terms of some of the things that we're going to be talking about here. Now, some of his other things are numerous to mention, but he's a veteran of the Marine Corps, worked for 12 years as in the federal government as a civilian employee, and also done some martial arts, I understand. So maybe he'll share that with us a little later. We don't have time, I don't think, for a demonstration, but believe me, if you knew this man, he could do it. All right. So welcome everybody. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with Willie is going to take us through some of the, because one of the things that happens in this discussion and conversation about voting is the issue of felony disenfranchisement. Really is one, I think, that is both confusing to a lot of people, or also sort of resides in that same kind of zone and feeling that many Americans have about convicts and about people in prison. There's not a lot of sympathy out there for ex-felons. But yet when we start to understand, as we are beginning to understand, the structure of mass incarceration, what folks today call the new Jim Crow, and even that longer history of slavery by another name, all of these things are stuff that his work is looking at, and he's going to help to elucidate some of the finer points of that detail. So Willie will be going first.
Good evening. So I'm just going to give a little quick overview of felony disenfranchisement. And in the back, if you're interested, there are flyers that they're nice enough to print out for us that you can take. It has a little bit more information. But for right now, so what is felony disenfranchisement? Basically, it's the practice of barring individuals convicted of a felony the right to vote in national and local elections. It's derived from the English common law, also referred to as civil death. During the colonial period, it was usually based on egregious violations of the moral code. After the American Revolution, states began to expand this and include disenfranchisement penalties as punishment for all felonies. The post-Civil War period saw a marked increase in the use of felony disenfranchisement, and by 1869, 29 states had enacted felony disenfranchisement laws, most of them aimed to limit non-land-owning citizens of voting privilege. During the post-Reconstruction period, which is approximately 1877, several southern states used felony disenfranchisement to target black people by using disenfranchisement as a penalty for felonies typically known to be committed by black men, but not white men, i.e., for example, domestic violence, theft, arson, and those type of, and also public vagrancy laws. It is also an attempt to limit the franchise for certain white men as well, as I said, non-property owning white men. While there have been attempts at reforms by individual states over the past 30 years, many still remain disenfranchised. So here, felony disenfranchisement laws today, as you can see by the map, where there's still laws. As of 2016, 6.1 million Americans, or 2.5% of the voting age population, were prohibited from voting due to laws that disenfranchise citizens convicted of felony offenses. Here are the top 10 states, the highest percentage of disenfranchised voters of 2016. Florida, though, actually reinstated the franchise, but then has recently repealed the franchise for 1.6 million people. So it shows you how flexible and fluid it could be. Some of the impacts of disenfranchisement: 7.4% of African Americans in the United States could not vote due to a felony conviction in 2016. In Kentucky, 26.15% of African Americans were disenfranchised, the highest percentage of all U.S. states. Florida had the highest total, 1.6 per capita, which is about 10% disenfranchised population of all states. Disenfranchisement policies disproportionately impact people of color. Nationwide, as of 2016, 1 in every 13 black adults could not vote as a result of a felony conviction. And in 4 states, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, more than 1 in 5 black adults was disenfranchised. Felony disenfranchisement has potentially affected the outcome of 7 U.S. Senate elections since 1970 and 1 presidential election since 2000. Not to mention communities impacted by mass incarceration lose potential voters who could influence public elections and change public policy. Restoring the vote to persons leaving prison could aid in their transition back into community life. Revocation of voting rights compounds the isolation of formerly incarcerated individuals from their communities, and civic participation has been linked with lower recidivism rates in most studies. One study among individuals who had, one study among individuals who had been arrested previously, 27% of non-voters were rearrested compared to 12% of voters. Denying the right to vote to an entire class of citizens is deeply problematic to a democratic society and counterproductive to effective reentry. Fortunately, many states are reconsidering the archaic disenfranchisement policies, with 24 states enacting reforms since 1997. But there is still much to be done before the United States will resemble comparable nations, which are other Western democratic nations in Europe, for example, in allowing full democratic participation of all citizens. And that is it. And if you want more information, a lot of this information came from the Sentencing Project. And as I said, there's flyers in the back that you can take a look at as well. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. We wanted Willie to start off with that information because I think it adds an important nuance where if we're talking politics and we're talking about the vote, there's votes here, a lot of votes, and they know that. And of course, this is part of the issue. So the other thing that probably needs to be said is that, of course, 2020 this year, in addition to being an election year, the theme for Black History Month this particular year is African Americans and the vote. And that theme is chosen and decided upon by, has been curated for years by the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, as mentioned earlier. And a lot of people were asking, is that because it's an election year that was the theme? And the answer is no. This is 2020 is the 150th anniversary, or sesquicentennial. We all had to learn to say that word this year. I think we all need to be honest that we didn't know how to say that word or what it meant, so we had to look it up. But the sesquicentennial of the 15th Amendment, which of course granted the right for black men to vote, and it's also the anniversary of the amendment which gave women the right to vote. And so Asala's most focused on sort of the black suffragist struggle and story, but entangled in that story is an interesting kind of give and take between the white women, the white suffragists that we sort of know about, Susan B. Anthony and so on, and that kind of thing, and a real sort of critical engagement there. And so our next panelist, Mia, is going to be speaking to that issue.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? How is this mic doing? We good? Okay. So I actually had an entree from that, but I'll go back to it.
Either way.
No, we're good. I'll do the history first. So yes, this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which is the amendment that gave women the right to vote. And if you spend any time in activist circles or if you just read about it, you'll hear a lot of people say, no, that gave white women the right to vote. And to a point that's true, but to a point that also erases the work of brilliant black suffragists who worked for that right to vote and were able to vote in 1920. And in fact, depending on where they lived, never didn't vote. And so I'm going to give a short history of that that's going to both acknowledge the racism involved in the women's suffrage movement, but also try and show that it's not as simple as that. And so we often talk about the split between the abolition movement or the black rights movement and the suffrage movement after the 15th Amendment. And the reason for that is that the women's suffrage movement came out of the abolition movement. Seneca Falls Convention had Frederick Douglass speaking there. And these movements were completely intertwined. And through the 14th Amendment, a lot of women said, great, we can vote under the 14th Amendment. No problem, the language is there. That didn't work. They tried. They were arrested. But after the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment was passed. And the 15th Amendment explicitly said that the vote was only for black men. And now, not only were white women left out, but black women were as well. And there was a huge schism about what the priorities should be and whether the victory should be taken and we should worry about women later. And as a result of this, you've probably heard some pretty racist quotes from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and some of those are just as racist as they seem. Some of them have been truncated to make them seem even more racist. A famous one is that Susan B. Anthony is quoted as saying that she would rather cut off her right arm than fight for the vote for the Negro, excuse me, man. But in reality, that quote said, I would rather cut off my right arm than fight for the vote of the Negro man only. Or first. I apologize. I could be misremembering that last word. It's been a long day. I taught today. Forgive me. So now this is in no way excusing the racism that came out of that. And some of the women in the suffrage movement saw an opportunity that in the South, fears of lynching and of black men, not fears of lynching, excuse me, the use of lynching and the claimed fears of black men and black sexuality fueled arguments that white women needed the right to vote. Because if white women had the right to vote, they could better protect themselves against the claims about black men and sexuality. And so the suffrage movement used that and used that racism and leaned into it. However, many Northern white women behind the scenes, sometimes publicly, were working with black women and black women suffragists. And those women's names deserve to be remembered. And this is, I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave off one of these amazing women's names. Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth were on the front lines from the moment after, and they never stopped working with the white women who we now see as racist. And they were racist. And Sojourner Truth famously refused to take sides between the two groups. And today we might call that her being aware of intersectionality, that she was being forced to choose between her race or her gender. But nevertheless, she remained working with both groups. Some of the other important women to remember are the Fortin sisters, Angelina Weld Grimke, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Annie Sims Banks, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells. And I'm going to take a minute and talk about what Ida B. Wells did for black women in voting. Ida B. Wells, as many people in this room I'm sure know, was a brilliant journalist, an anti-lynching activist, and she was driven out of the South because of her anti-lynching activism. She moved to Chicago, and she became very active in politics there and in the suffrage movement. And she did something more. She participated with some of the other women, Mary Church Terrell, for example, in starting these social clubs that were meant to educate black women and bring them into the vote and to show them how important voting was and to argue on behalf of it. And my favorite story about Ida B. Wells with this is that she traveled with her delegation to the 1913 March for women's suffrage. And when she got there, she was told, that she had to march in the back with the other black women suffragists who were there. And instead, she stood to the side. And when her delegation reached where she was, she joined them. And no one ever said anything to her, because what could you possibly say? And so while we acknowledge the deep racism in the movement and the fact that 1920 did not guarantee the right for all women in this country, Native American women didn't even get the right then, we don't want to forget these brilliant women who fought for the vote and did vote. Many of them voted. In fact, so many black women voted in Florida in 1920 that they changed the laws to keep them from voting. I don't know how I am on time, but okay, double checking. The great presentation we just had about felon disenfranchisement is actually also a great lead-in to talking about the ways in which voter suppression particularly targets women. As you might have seen, this was a lot about what happens when people are incarcerated. Many people in this room might not know that if you're incarcerated awaiting trial, you legally have the right to vote in New York. But the problem is that the people in jail need to do the work to let you vote. Because if you're behind bars, you can't do that on your own. You need someone to bring you the ballot. You need someone to maybe even help you register. And the reason why this is relevant to women in voter suppression is because women are much more likely to be held in jail pending trial. Women often find cash to bail men out of jail, but they are the breadwinners often, or just more willing to sacrifice that money to get someone out of jail. And when women are arrested, they often don't make bail. And maybe they say that money needs to go to feeding their children, or maybe they say that, it's just not there. I wish I knew all these stories. But nevertheless, it is much more likely for a woman, likely a woman of color, to be held in jail pending trial, and she hasn't even been convicted of anything, and if she's there during an election, it's very unlikely she's going to be able to vote, despite that being a guaranteed right. And it's up to us to bring those things, to go into jails and to bring them ballots and to do the work. A few other ways in which voter suppression targets women. I see some women in here, I'm not gonna make you tell me, but 90% of women change their name when they get married or divorced. And luckily in New York, we don't have to deal with this, but if you live in a strict voter ID state, that means that up to 30% of women, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, don't have the proper documentation to get an ID to vote. Because if you're in a strict voter ID state, that name better match perfectly, and it better match your current address. And we can't always get the right documentation. Sometimes originals are required. Sometimes it costs a lot of money. Sometimes it just doesn't happen in time. And particularly if you've gone through multiple marriages or multiple divorces, that gets harder and harder and harder every time to prove. And unfortunately, of course, lower income women, disabled women, black women, other women of color are always going to be disproportionately impacted. I wish I had stats that broke down by race, but due to the gender data gap, we don't have enough of these stats. So I have to give you stats based on women in general, and you have to know that it disproportionately impacts women of color. Additionally, if you're a victim of domestic violence, you might be worried about your information being public. And then registering to vote carries with it a whole host of concerns. And for many, it's just easier not to vote because if it's your survival or voting, unfortunately, that's often an easy choice. Many states have something called address confidentiality programs, ACP programs. Now, these programs protect their addresses in terms of a separate PO box and just generally. They don't always protect your right to register to vote be kept private. And so we have so many women and men, but of course mostly women, who are victims of domestic violence, who can't register to vote out of fear that their abusers will find their address. And of course, you're only allowed to use an ACP program if you have brought your abuser to court, which is a whole nother obstacle that is not an option for many. I don't know how many people in here have been paying attention to the primaries, but if you have, you know that some states still use caucuses. I could give a whole presentation on why I think caucuses are bizarre, but for women, they are a nightmare. If you are, again, a woman who is in an abusive relationship, you can't go in there and vote differently than your abuser. If you have children, what are you supposed to do with them? If, as women, are more likely to work hourly wage jobs with weird hours, how are you supposed to get off work to caucus? How are you supposed to stand in the face of someone intimidating you if you are a small woman who maybe just can't stand up to that? No shame, I'm 5'2". I have a big mouth on me, clearly, but I don't want to stand up to someone screaming in my face. There are so many ways in which women are particularly targeted by voter suppression tactics, and due to the gender data gap, we have almost no statistics on it. I've literally given you every statistic that exists on it out of my mouth tonight.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Mia. Which obviously could go further.
I can keep going.
As you can see, I told you. I'm so proud of each and every one of these individuals. That's yes, thank you. And hopefully there'll be more time to draw out and tease out some of them. But you gave us a lot to work with, and I think thank you so much. All right, William, you are a Renaissance man, as we read in your bio, and I know you have probably a number of different ways to sort of help us to understand some of this information. And I'll let you. I can let you just do that if you please, and just. But I do want to start to transition as you make your comments, maybe just helping us to understand. Some of these nuances and you hear a lot of people today saying, what's the point of voting? Why should I waste my vote? Or we all know people, I think if we're being really honest, who just say, I'm not gonna vote. I don't vote. And so what can we be doing to encourage people to change their minds? What is behind that statement? Seems to me that's sort of that's saying a lot in and of itself. Saying I'm not going to vote. There's some anger behind that, perhaps, or some resentment, well-founded considering our history, as we've been hearing, and so forth. But how do we get people to sort of change that? And maybe you could deal with that part at the end of your comments.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out and celebrating Black History Month. Asala had indicated that the theme of Asala this month is about the African American in the vote. Asala makes a strong emphasis this year to take African American history or Black history beyond the month of February. Too often, our institutions, organizations, they have the African celebration of African American history for February, and then it goes away. It's something that needs to be engaged from all levels. So maybe this would be the start that we can move this narrative beyond the month of February. My peers have indicated historically the problems with felony disenchantment, as well as women's suffrage, the problems and the issues at hand. I'm going to move a little further because they have provided the foundational historical information that we need to understand that change has not taken place in over 100 years. We're still in the same position, but with a different narrative. Change is a constant variable, all right? And if change doesn't happen, then that means stagnation sets in. When we look at the election this year, and we look at the vote, because now we're going to talk about the vote. Everyone talks about the White House vote, the primaries. Professor Miletsky indicated, well, some people say, well, I don't want to vote. Why should I vote? Because the reason why they feel this way, because there has not been enough effort to provide information at the grassroots level. Most individuals at the grassroots level are voting out of emotion. In the article that was presented with Dr. Miletsky, I indicated that the vote has to be an informative vote. It cannot be a vote based on party, Democrat or Republican. It has to be based off information. Too often is that information passed down. We see our assemblymen, congressmen, senators, mayors, when it's election time, what happens? They show up. But what happens after that? After they're elected? We need to understand their record. How are they voting? Because you can have somebody in office for 1 year, 2 years, and they can be voting totally against what your principles are. You need to know what their record is like. We have to become a community that's more well-informed in order to offset this. We have to hold our officials accountable. And because we're not holding them accountable, you're seeing the end result. Statistically, the black vote is diminishing. We had Barack Obama. Everybody was like, all right, Barack, we're all in. His second 4 years, the percentage of the African-American vote dropped. What's going on? Where's the enthusiasm? We need to be thinking about this. Currently, we have an election coming up. Where's the enthusiasm and the drive? Is it based on, okay, I don't like the current position, well, why don't you like it? Not just because your mother or your grandmother or your pastor, rabbi, imam says that, oh, guess what? I think you should vote this way. Recently, there was endorsement with Vice President Biden. And he says, you should go out here. He's been the true test of the storm. We cannot hold on to the legacy of the past. You must rethink, reposition yourself, all right, if you're really looking at changing the current narrative. I said that recently he got a endorsement. Yes.
Clyburn, I believe.
Clyburn, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Yes. So I'm trying to stay current because that's what's important. We need to stay current so that we can address issues when questions arise, so we can say, okay, yes, he was just endorsed. So we realized that, and we knew that he was going to do that because he made indication yesterday that he's going to make his announcement. So with that being said, this is how I see the vote. All that has passed on has laid the foundation. So the question that I raise is, what do we do from here? How do we change the narrative? And I would welcome those comments when we have a period of time instruction that we can address those.
Excellent. Yeah, well, you raised a lot of interesting issues. All of you raised a lot of interesting issues, and I told you we intend to have a full investigation here tonight, this evening, on all the issues that are affecting, and they are pertinent issues, right? Last night at Stony Brook, we had Corey Wise, one of the known as before as the Central Park Five, now the exonerated Five, and what came out of that discussion, you realize that the people who are in positions, DAs, prosecutors, who were able in this case to force a young man who only went down to the station to accompany his friend, they could psychologically place enough pressure on him to give a confession for something that he was not even at. But a lot of those people are elected. They're elected into positions, not all the time, and it depends on the place, but assistant DAs, and so forth. And so one of the things William and all of the comments made me just think of is the importance of these local elections. We are, of course, focused on the big one, right? How could we not be? Any presidential year, the whole nation's eyes are fixed to the presidential election. But in fact, and this may be, the thing that might save us this year, because when you look at the landscape of candidates, at least on the Democratic side this year now, we've noticed, it's hard not to notice, there's no African-American candidates sort of, in the running, any major ones anyways. And so, that might be partly an answer to your question of what is the interest anymore? What is the connection? But local elections remain relevant. You could argue more relevant in many ways than what's happening right now on the national level. And we know what's happening on the national level. It's a bit of a mess. And I don't mean that in a partisan way. Whatever party you're in, it's a mess, I think. So with that kind of in mind, I want to get at we want to get at that question. One of the things I've been noticing in my discussions with people too is a lot of people doubt. They doubt that there are impediments to voting. They doubt that there's voter suppression happening at all, even though it's been widely reported on. It's literally in our faces, black and white print. They doubt that this voter ID thing is some kind of measure hearkening back to a time of Jim Crow, that when people make a comparison between some of the voter suppression tactics happening now and some of the more popularly known voter suppression tactics that happened in the past, like the poll tax, the grandfather clause, literacy tests, and all of these things. They say, no, that's not the same thing. Voter ID, that's harm. That has nothing to do with this. Okay, I guess we're crazy then. But and I want to mention, people paid their poll tax. People paid it proudly, right? So you can have an impediment, but for many African Americans, as someone once said, there's no shame in being black, but it's mighty inconvenient at times. They paid the poll tax and showed up. So I find all those things kind of fascinating. So especially when people say they don't want to vote, with all that history, what are we to respond to that? Willie or Mia may want to jump in there.
Yeah. In terms of voter ID laws, voter ID laws. It's interesting. Recently, I was reading about the RNC and the DNC are suing each other in, I believe it's Michigan. And what's going on is, when we see these disenfranchised people who are not able to vote, what happens is, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. What happens is, when you have the laws and you can't get your ID straight. Give me one sec. I apologize. I lost my train of thought. I have a couple different ideas here, and I'm just trying to struggle through them.
Take your time.
Yeah, I apologize. But basically, voter ID laws create obstacles for people to vote. We already mentioned that a few times. One of the issues that's come up recently, again, in Michigan, for example, the RNC is suing the DNC about carpooling laws. And why is that important? Because for people who can't, who can't maybe drive themselves to a polling station, or people who don't have vehicles, or people who just want to get together and vote together and travel together. If they do that, it's a misdemeanor. And why are they doing that? They're doing that because they're trying to eliminate certain people from voting in certain areas. This kind of goes to this idea of, they call jail gerrymandering or prison gerrymandering, where you move people from an urban area or from some suburban area where they're arrested and they're placed in prison, and they lose the right to vote, and then they go into prison, but they're counted towards the caucus or towards the population of the county that the prison's in. They can't vote, but they can, their bodies count towards the voting, so they have unequal, yeah. So, so the idea of voter ID laws, again, it's a way of criminalizing not just color, not just race, but also poverty. It's a way of stigmatizing people where they feel that they're not up to par, they're not actually equal citizens, that they can participate in our elections, and it's something that transcends class as well. For example, there was, if you guys are familiar with George Steinbrenner, the former Yankee owner from the 90s and so forth, he was a felon in the 70s for fraud, election fraud. And he lost the right to vote for a couple of years in the 70s. And it it stuck with him. And he said that not being able to vote, not being able to participate, he was voting for Nixon, that was his thing. But he said not being able to participate, it hurt him. He was a patriotic American. He loved his country. He wanted to be a part of it. He had the resources where he was able to, after a couple years, re-enfranchise himself because he had virtually unlimited resources. But then you find someone who doesn't have the resources, someone who's poorer, someone that can't afford or doesn't know. Like Mia was saying earlier, people aren't aware of what their rights are as felons, as convicted felons or potentially felons. They're stuck with it. They're stuck with it for the rest of their lives, regardless of whether they can do it or they can get it reversed or not. And it's a stigma that they can't participate in their communities. They can't participate in local elections. They can't participate in dialogues about these. They can only watch, and it's something that really affects the way people feel about themselves and the way they feel about each other. So I kind of hit on a couple different topics there. I'll let you handle it.
The George Steinbrenner, no one will ever forget that example, I don't think.
Yeah, and also just building on that, for one thing, voter ID laws are claimed to be needed because of voter fraud. But studies have shown that voter fraud, in terms of individual voter fraud, not what he did with election fraud, basically doesn't exist. It's something like they've done studies, and out of 1 million voters, they'll find 2 examples of voter fraud. So that's one argument against voter ID laws. They're to fix a problem that doesn't exist. Another is, like in New York, we don't have voter ID laws. We're fine. It's not a problem. Additionally, as I mentioned, women aren't the only people who suffer from those kinds of things. A middle-class white woman might have trouble getting a voter ID that correctly matches her name. If you move and you don't get an ID with your driver's license, let's say you move a county. Like, if you move across county lines, you don't need a new state ID, but you don't have the right address on it anymore. And if you go to vote at a polling place, they could tell you that ID is incorrect. So this idea of, well, everyone has an ID. For one thing, they don't. But for another, even people who do have IDs have their votes suppressed. And if you need any more evidence that voter ID laws are racist, a North Carolina law was overturned after 2016 because they passed a voter ID law, and then what they did was close DMVs in majority-minority neighborhoods. So, that to me is pretty big proof. I'll add one more thing and then pass it along, because obviously I could keep talking. It's a problem, I'm sorry. Is that...
We love it.
A lot of these new voter suppression laws have sprung up after 2013. And in 2013, we had a case go to the Supreme Court called Shelby v. Holder. And what Shelby v. Holder did was it overturned one tiny part of the Voting Rights Act that basically made the Voting Rights Act inapplicable anymore. And so what happened was, from the Voting Rights Act in 1965 to 2013, we had a period where voting laws, particularly in southern states, had to be approved by the federal government. And then after 2013, that ended. And it really empowered a lot of Republican, it is partisan, a lot of Republican voter suppression laws to be passed. And so 2016, when we talk about minority turnout, when we talk about what was mentioned in terms of black turnout going down, part of it could be apathy, part of it could be information. A huge amount of it is that 2016 was the first election we've had since 1965 without the Voting Rights Act. 14 states had new voter suppression laws between the 2012 election and the 2016 election.
Yeah, that's a major piece. Thank you for reminding us about that, because the Voting Rights Act, which is due to be renewed, was not quite renewed, or was renewed in a much more watered-down fashion.
They still don't have the formula. It still hasn't been.
Yeah, it ripped the guts out of it. Basically, was what my understanding was. Yes.
In New York, do you have to present an ID?
No.
No. And
The first time if you have registered to vote at a new location, let's say, the first time you do have to show identification, not afterwards.
Really? I literally never heard.
If you have moved.
That's true.
Yeah, if you have moved
I have to
even
show.
to the same county, even in the same town.
Yeah.
you don't, your ID in that register shows your name and your address and party affiliation and so on. And if you elect to show a party affiliation, and if there's any change, you need to show identification, but not afterwards, only the first time. However, the voting rolls are loaded with mistakes.
Yeah.
People who have moved, people who have died. You know, it's the old Chicago story.
Right.
And there's so many errors in there.
Yeah.
If you insist that you have right, you're in the right public place and so on, you can vote by affidavit. But that's the best you can do. And it's just, there are monumental errors.
Yeah.
You can also do a same day, go to a judge if you think you've been purged. No, I'm
Yeah.
just offering the information.
But this
You can.
is good data because it adds a human face to the day-to-day. I knew you were going to say that. No one knows that much about voting except volunteers and people who work there. Yeah,
I was going to say, no, you can't. Like, I've never had to show ID.
I think it's implemented differently. It can be implemented differently.
A lot of poll
Community
workers,
volunteers.
Sorry, this is actually a huge issue too. The training of poll workers isn't even across different places. In New York, you shouldn't ever have to show an ID to vote.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So you know, I want to move toward a discussion. We wanted to do that, and that's a very important thing. I just wanted. Did you want to have a chance to say anything else?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to pose a question. We're going to look at things from a different perspective, all right? Because that's what we have to do. We have to change our thinking. So we just mentioned the fact about these laws and how they're suppressing the vote. And how they're suppressing the vote. So the question that I'm looking at, and I'm take a different position, I'm gonna look at it from a different lens. What are the strategies that have been implemented to offset this? We know that the plan is to suppress. What is the intellectual think tank, the legal minds, all right, of those who are being suppressed? What has been done, and why are they not proactive in offsetting this? Just another way of thinking.
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting question. One thing I think we wouldn't have done our duty tonight if we don't at least mention the fact that we've had foreign interference in our elections. Okay, in a place that seemed unthinkable. And America and how sacrosanct we hold democracy and our election process and the democratic process, etc. We've had foreign intervention in our election in 2016.
And this year.
And even though we're going to pretend like we don't know what's going on, we know it's happening in 2020. I don't have any proof of, there's no smoking gun about Iowa, but I feel like we're going to hear something. When you tell me an app went crazy, okay, interesting. A lot of things went crazy. But what we do know for sure, we know that there's, whatever their intentions, the Russians seem to know something that we here in America may have forgotten, which is how important and critical the black vote is. Because one of the things they were doing was creating, I read, thousands and thousands of false Facebook profiles of supposed African-American voters, African-Americans, saying things on Facebook, doing things. And it really, really did what it was intended to do in many ways, which is to utilize the power of the black swing vote, which is critical. And from what I've been understanding, now you're all reading different sources, but some credible sources that I have read suggest that this had a lot to do with Trump's getting elected in 2016. A lot of people who had voted for Obama, whether they're black or not, changed their view, and a lot of this intervention is part of the reason. So I guess my point there is, on the one hand, while that's very scary, in terms of answering that first question we started with, why should I vote? You know, they understand the power of your vote. Why don't we understand the power of our vote, right? And so that's a heavy one to end off on. But I'd invite any wrapping up comments there, or we could also maybe go to the audience and have some response with that.
We talked about legislative disenfranchisement or deliberate disenfranchisement, but the voter who chooses not to go is self-disenfranchisement. He's simply backed out of the system. He wants no part of it. And it seems to me, they keep talking about the undecided. No, it's the unheard, the ones that don't even, they feel so separated
Come around.
from what's going on that there's just no need. What's the point? You know, it's an old story about everyone is asked.
Won't reach completely, but
Yeah,
Won't
it's
reach.
okay. I'll move over. Okay. Yeah, everyone is asked to bring a little wine to a party, and okay, it's very comfortable. It's cozy.
We're married 55 years.
It's okay. Everyone is asked to bring a bit of wine to the party, and each one decides, well, if I just bring water, with all that wine, who's going to notice? But when it comes to pouring the wine, all they have is water. So if you have come to the decision that it doesn't matter what I do, what kind of weight do I carry? Well, if enough people decide they don't carry any weight, then they're right. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So self-disenfranchisement or bowing out of the system is every bit as important as those who have been deliberately segregated or have it made impossible for them to express their choice.
Now respond.
interesting. And I know we can all hear each other in here, but we are recording, so that's why we're doing it that way. So if anyone would like to respond, this is the. You don't have to sit on his lap or mine. Oh, yeah, Dr. Colson, all right. In the house, cool.
Sure, I just wanted to add a little something to our discussion, and just recognizing that for me and my belief that I see that at a young age that our children are not seeing the representation as far as just starting within the school systems, as far as looking at administration, teachers, seeing that where they make a difference, and then as they continue to grow and mature, then they come in contact and further see that where is the, President Obama was elected, but look at how long and how hard, and then it's gone. As far as, so I think it's just so important that that we recognize that the vote does make a difference, but it's very difficult when at young ages they're not seeing, and then where do they do see a lot of representation? Unfortunately, there's a lot of representation in incarceration. There's a lot of representation in areas where we don't want them to go and don't want them to see, as far as in the entertainment, industry. There's an overrepresentation, but to where a lot of young students that they believe that this is or athletics, and then they don't realize that there's other parts, and really. I think I'll stop there. And
I have a quick response to that?
Sure.
It has to do with Black History Month, too, so it really ties in.
Good seeing.
I have the honor of teaching a Black History class, and I'm TAing Professor Miletsky's. And something that I think is so important about Black History Month, which should go longer, and that I think is so important about these classes and it as a discipline, is that too often American history for Black people is taught as oppression and victimhood. And there's so many beautiful stories of exactly what you're talking about. And that's one of the reasons why I was not leaving this room without giving that list of these amazing women. And I think it's the point, right? It's the point of our system, of systemic racism, that we see more of the entertainers or the people incarcerated, even though so many other people exist. But it's this narrative, particularly for our history, something that I love in the class that I teach is every time we learn about a new great, hero from African American history, they want to know why they haven't learned about them. And it's because it serves the purpose. And that's why panels like this, Black History Month, Africana Studies as a discipline are so urgent. And forgive me, I think it speaks exactly to what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things we really do well to recognize those historical examples of grit. I'm going to pay the poll tax even though it's an insult to my dignity to do so, and no one else has to do so, but I'm going to do it. That's how important this vote for me is. I'm going to lose credit at the company store. I'm going to lose my reputation, my ability to make a livelihood or feed my family. That's how important it is, or it was, to folks, some of the people that have been mentioned, to vote, to exercise their constitutional right to do so. We're going to go just real quick. Willie was going to add something.
I just wanted to add in terms of criminalization in Black communities and kind of the stigma of criminalization of Black youth in particular, and how that affects their sense of self in terms of participating in society. One historian calls it the condemnation of Blackness. Crime has always been associated with Blackness since the emancipation, through chain gangs, through convict leasing, up to the history of the 20th century, and up to today, where you see mass incarceration, where you see over-policing of Black neighborhoods, you see surveillance within schools, within the communities, not just from the police, but also from people surrounding them. So I think what that does is it creates this stigma of just, I'm not part of society, so why should I care? Why should I vote for Obama if Obama is, this guy talking about pathology of the Black family, or he's talking about, this or that? He doesn't relate to me. So there's this gap between, that policing and over surveillance really kind of puts on people's backs, Black people, young Black people in particular, where they just aren't, they don't view themselves as part of the democratic body.
Okay. You wanted to say something, sir?
Yes, I wanted to give an example that somebody who I actually work with gave in regards to your comment about just seeing people as victims. He was talking about, which is a whole other subject, he felt that a lot of people from foreign countries who are Black don't identify as Black, because he said that they just viewed us as being slaves. And he said it was just poetic. He says, we were kings. We were regular people. We've had whole lives after slavery. And there was a patron here, Black man I knew. He said what they do is they look at us as if we have the deprived childhood. And Chris Rock, in one of his Everybody Hates Chris, did a riff on that. Do you remember when the social worker came to the home? And she was assuming that there were no presents. And but I wish the man was here to actually give words. But the truth is that, people are much more than victims.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at there, and you raised some interesting issues. I think maybe William maybe could speak to real quickly, but sometimes I've experienced this myself. Sometimes people are, why do we have to always focus on slavery? What are some of the other, and that's an interesting point. Right now we're in a somewhat related, to bring sort of reconnecting debate with regard to reparations, in the reparations movement here, and there are Black Americans, African Americans, who are saying, reparations should really be focused on, as they call it, and as they call themselves, American descendants of slavery, or ADOS. I don't know if anyone's heard about, familiar.
Russian taken over.
Yes. Well, this was. It's true. There's something going on there. So I don't know. Well, maybe you can help us to. You sound like you were nodding as this gentleman was speaking. So what were you going to say there?
So there are a couple of things that I need to address at this time. The distinguished lady said no hope, separated, impactful, why should not vote? The gentleman, distinguished gentleman who came forward, talked about representation. When you don't see these things in your community, when you don't see them on the media, they're not put over the waves, they're not translated through music and lyrics and video, representation, it has a problem. When media, TV personalities come on TV and say, I have never voted except for the first time for Barack Obama. What was that individual doing all these times? And the impact that he had on the sports community. And who am I referring to? Stephen A. Smith.
All right.
These are things that we have to look at. No hope. What is the impact of the election on me? I have 4 brothers. My parents are struggling. My community is dilapidated. No one is coming in and helping me. But yet you want me to vote. Vote for what? Why should I vote? Look at it from a different lens. See, we can talk about it in this setting here because we've been fortunate to have been exposed to this data. But what about the one that's really struggling, whether they be white or black, from Appalachia to West Virginia to here and the ghettos of New York City?
We're talking about hopelessness.
Hopelessness. So something has to be done. And then so maybe we need to go back, as Professor Miletsky said earlier, what are your local politicians doing? Who are they educating? And as far as you were saying, some people don't feel that, they have this sense that we are not a people of stature, okay? Well, that is by design as well. Don't think that this is happenstance. It is by design to fragment a group of people from diverse backgrounds for a slice of pie.
Yeah. Let's give it up. That was so it, yeah.
Grew up in Louisiana, these blacks who said they tried to enslave the Indians. But what my friend's quote is that they tried to enslave the Indians, but they weren't able to do that. And he said, we were able to withstand it and be productive. But, which is true. It's another way of looking at it.
Yeah. Some little more to that too. But yeah.
They were on home base.
They also were enslaved.
You have a culture. Somebody takes you out of it, enslaves you, but you're still in the same geographic neighborhood. It wasn't like how many thousands of miles of ocean between where you're enslaved and where you were born. So for the Native Americans, they may have attempted to enslave them, but, they get away however they can. They got a place to go to. You got a place to run to.
But he's talking about that they actually died. They couldn't withstand.
But I still think they also had an ability to escape. They had connections on the outside.
According to all these interesting people who aren't here.
Yeah, but the vote. Okay, yeah.
Well, you talk, what, half the country, half the adult population doesn't vote. And I met one of the gentlemen who helped write the EHA, the Education of the Handicapped Act. And we had a interesting debate over the fact that it was like, they had FAPE, free appropriate public education, LRE, least restrictive environment. You go back to with school segregation, they said with all God's speed. The system, the way they write the laws, the way it's vague. And then they set up a system where To get the law to do what it's supposed to do, you have to. It's an argument. It's not a conversation, and within the disability community, there's a certain, mindset of what a free, appropriate education is. But for the general public, who doesn't deal with that on a day-to-day basis, they have a different generalization. That stuff wears you down. When it's, the glacial change, it's evolutionary, not revolutionary. And, going back, just like we tend to blame individuals from a different time, but we take it out of context of that time frame. And like I say, how the Constitution was written, it was written not necessarily 100% concrete. And the amendments, some were more concrete than others. Here in Brentwood, we have a county legislative district, we have an assembly state district. They were supposed to be minority districts. But the way they were created, you got to be a middle of a road person to get to be elected. You can't be too far right, you can't be too far left. You get mediocrity.
I'll also just mention,
Thank you.
because you brought up the disability community, only 27% of polling places are fully ADA accessible.
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that make you just pull your hair out of your head, right? And yeah, so we have a lot. There is a lot to contend with, and it does, in many ways, lead to anger, apathy, disaffection, cynicism. But what I'm hearing too, if I understood correctly, at best we may call it our system of checks and balances and compromise, but at worst, it's really a divide and conquer kind of thing, and it constituencies and groups that should be working together can't work together, or with gerrymandering and redistricting and all of these different tricks, really, techniques, we'll call them techniques, because we're going to be nice tonight. But what they really do is keep folk from really getting together and empowering themselves, only so much. And so that's, I think that's useful. It's a lot of the same kind of things that have been said here tonight. We have to be educated about this. That's clear, I think, right? And that is not about formal education, but educate ourselves wherever we come, whatever walk of life we come from, wherever we're coming from, about the nuances, the details, the fine print, right? This country's always very good at doing the best at legal stuff, which is probably no other country on earth that has done. But sometimes we also get blind to what's happening. We imprison more people than any other country in the world. We come up with new ideas like privatized prisons. Okay, well, what if we take these things that the state has done historically and privatize them? It's one of the fastest growing industries in America. And you can buy stock, it's right on trading on the stock market as we speak. Okay. So you can see when Willie was talking about, you can see that there is an economic impetus to these kinds of things and to warehousing people. And even as it is, the people who are, whose votes are not impinged upon, there's always historically only been, as someone mentioned, I think, a somewhat small percent of the population that actually votes in America, right? So I think the powers that be come to depend on these kinds of forces so that they can oftentimes remain in power. And that doesn't mean everyone is bad who's in power, but more often than not, that has been to the detriment of people of color in this country, but also women, disabled, Native Americans, African Americans certainly, and obviously, and Asian Americans as well, had something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know. And just, America's just bold, you know. put the name right in the act, Chinese Exclusion Act. It tells you right what it is. So you know, I think I don't want to go on and on, but I guess I know we're coming to time, and we may have to, unless anyone is dying to say anything else. And that's okay if you are, but we're a little bit over what we said. But I think you know what it comes down to is trying to find empowerment in and amongst these problems. We've laid out the problems, I think, extremely well tonight. But our history is filled with stories of people who succeeded and who survived despite these problems. And I think that, to me, is the best part of our system, you know. If you have the personal grit to do it, if you have God give you a mind to do it, and you have the ability if they can get around stuff, we can get around stuff too. And historically, that has been the case, and it's brought out in those cases the best of America. You know, if America said all men are created equal but was not able to live up to it, there have been groups, African Americans and other groups, have come forward and helped America to live up to its own potential greatness. Because these groups love America, and I think we all feel that way. So, we want to give our panel a thanks for brilliantly dissecting the issues. Staying pretty good on the partisanship thing. I don't think we knew. We couldn't tell what's happening there. And you know, and we'll keep this coffee, and I don't know how long until they kick us out. I guess we stay, but we invite you to come and continue the dialogue with us, and we thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Despite only having an hour, Zebulon and his fellow speakers shared a wealth of information and even had time for some engaging discussions with our fellow patrons and librarians. Thank you again, Zebulon, Mia, and Willie, alongside everyone else who participated. And thanks as always to you, the listener, and to the Brentwood Historical Society for making Brentwood Stories possible. The music for today's episode was brought to you courtesy of Kevin MacLeod at incomtech.filmmusic.io.